Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The call came in just after 2:22 a.m. A teenager, frantic. My mom, she's not moving. In Deltona, Florida, what started as another quiet Sunday would end in the kind of horror that communities never fully recover from. Ashley Vaya, 38, was found in her bedroom with a single gunshot wound to the head. She was pronounced dead at the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Her 2-year-old child was found asleep in the adjacent room. The front door was locked. The back door was not. The weapon used was not recovered. There were no immediate suspects at the scene. 9 days before her death, Ashley had called police after her ex-husband, Samuel Vaya, entered her home without permission and allegedly assaulted her. He was arrested and later released on bond. A no-contact order was issued. Firearms were supposed to be surrendered, but Ashley had told a friend, he gave them what they asked for, not everything. Her voice memo, saved 2 nights before her death, had no screaming, no hysteria, just quiet dread. If something happens, it won't be because I didn't see it coming. Ashley lived in a quiet neighborhood in Deltona, a mid-sized Florida suburb, often defined more by its retirees and Sunday markets than homicide rates. She had 3 children, 2 adults from a previous relationship, and a toddler she shared with Samuel. She worked part-time at a local insurance processing firm and spent most evenings at home. She was not involved in drugs. She had no known criminal ties. By all accounts, Ashley was trying to rebuild a life that had unraveled slowly over several years, and more violently in the final few weeks. Her friends described her as tired but trying. Her daughter said she was more worried about what might happen than what had already happened. In her own police report filed March 23, 2025, Ashley told officers, "He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He just stood over me and whispered, 'I think he wants me afraid.'" The officer noted no visible injuries. Samuel was taken into custody. A $2,000 bond was granted within 12 hours. The court ordered him to stay away. He turned in 3 registered firearms. That was the end of it, officially. But unofficially, Samuel never left. The days that followed his release would later be reconstructed through a combination of neighborhood security footage, license plate tracking data, and timeline analysis. A gray Nissan Pathfinder, registered to Samuel's sister, was seen circling Ashley's neighborhood late at night on March 25th, 26, and 29. Each time, the vehicle remained in the area between 1 and 2:30 a.m. On March 27th, a doorbell camera captured the shadow of a man lingering at the corner of Ashley's house for over 6 minutes. The man never approached the door, never knocked. He waited, watched, then left. Ashley didn't report it. Instead, she changed the locks. She stopped sleeping with the lights off. She had her daughter move her bedroom to the front of the house. She double-checked the back entrance every night. She didn't file for custody adjustments. She told a friend, "I don't want him thinking I'm taking our son away." That's when people snap. In retrospect, it was a calculated decision to avoid escalation. But for investigators, it was also the window in which the case could have turned and didn't. From a forensic standpoint, there was no documented violation of the restraining order. No trespassing charge was pursued. The firearm he kept, a Glock 19 he claimed was sold months ago, was never reported missing or unregistered. There was no legal trigger to rearrest him. No judge had cause to order further supervision. In her final text, Ashley expressed concern, not panic. On March 30th at 10:43 p.m., she messaged a coworker, "Long week, just hoping next one's better. If you don't hear from me Monday, it means I overslept." She never made it to Monday. According to the preliminary investigation report, the shot was fired sometime between 2:15 and 2:20 a.m. Her daughter, returning from a friend's house, found Ashley face down on the floor next to her bed. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. The toddler had not woken. The bullet entered from the rear left side of her skull. The trajectory suggested the shooter stood over her, angled slightly to the left. The kill was quick, deliberate, close. The detective leading the case, Angela Kiefer, wrote in her initial log, "The entry wound tells us 2 things. 1, she never saw it coming. 2, he wanted it that way. But at that point, no names had been released. No conclusions were being drawn, only questions. Why wasn't the house alarm tripped? Why was the rear sliding door unlocked when Ashley was known to secure it religiously? Why was there only one set of adult footprints, barefoot, visible in the hallway? The absence of evidence, for some investigators, is often more revealing than the presence of it. As Kiefer would later note, you don't get this clean of a scene unless someone's thought it through. And someone had. It wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned and practiced. Deltona had seen domestic violence cases before. Some got messy, some made the news, but this wasn't just another abusive ex. This was methodical, clinical, strategic. Whoever pulled that trigger wasn't caught in the moment. They created it. The autopsy wouldn't be completed for another 48 hours, but early indicators showed no signs of recent physical assault, no drugs in her system, no trace DNA under her fingernails or on her clothing. Nothing that suggested she fought or even had the chance to. The scene didn't bleed chaos. It breathed control. For the first responders, the most haunting part wasn't the body. It was the child, still asleep in the next room, undisturbed, blissfully unaware that their mother's last breath had already passed. One investigator later said, "There's something about that level of silence that feels louder than any scream." Ashley Via's case wouldn't become a headline because of celebrity or scandal. It became one because of the silence, the kind that followed warnings ignored, systems followed to the letter, and a predator who understood those letters better than most. There was no break-in. There was no struggle. But there was intent. And intent leaves traces, even when it doesn't leave blood. March 23, 2025. Just past 3 a.m., a call came through to Volusia County Dispatch from a residence on Everett Street in Deltona. The voice on the line was steady, but the tension underneath was clear. The caller identified herself as Ashley Via. She reported that her ex-husband had entered the house uninvited, that he'd put his hands on her, and that she didn't feel safe. Officers responded within 7 minutes. Their body-worn cameras documented the exterior of a quiet, dimly lit home. Ashley met them at the door, barefoot, arms crossed. She pointed them to the back hallway. Inside, Samuel Via was seated calmly on the edge of the bed. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't raise his voice. When asked why he was there, he responded, "I came to see my son." There were no bruises visible on Ashley's body. She declined medical attention, but her account was consistent. She told officers that Samuel had entered using a key he still had from before their separation. He didn't break in. He didn't yell. He walked in, closed the bedroom door behind him, and began accusing her of cheating. According to her, he pinned her by the shoulders to the mattress and refused to let her up. Her daughter, hearing the disturbance, intervened. Both Ashley and her daughter provided written statements. The responding officers noted signs of prior emotional distress in the home, but found no immediate threat to other occupants. Still, Samuel was taken into custody and charged with misdemeanor battery, domestic violence. He was released later that same day on a $2,000 bond. The court issued a standard no-contact order and instructed Samuel to surrender all firearms within 48 hours. He signed an affidavit affirming compliance. Records show he turned in 3 legally registered handguns, but there was no physical verification by law enforcement, no request for a search warrant, and no follow-up inspection. Ashley had told officers she believed Samuel still had a black Glock he never registered. That claim was entered into the incident report, but no action was taken on it. At that point, by the book, the system had done its part. The arrest was logged, bond paid, conditions set. On paper, everything checked out. Ashley told a friend later that week, "He didn't yell. That's what scared me." In a recorded voice note dated March 25th, she said, "I can't prove he's hiding anything, but I know him. He doesn't give things up easily." What stands out in hindsight is the pattern. This wasn't a single outburst. According to neighbors, Ashley and Samuel had a history. Arguments in the driveway. Police at the door at least twice in the past year. But no prior arrests, no restraining orders. This March 23rd arrest was the first time it crossed the legal threshold. Investigators reviewing the March 23rd incident later identified a procedural gap. The firearms surrender was based solely on self-reporting. There was no enforcement mechanism to confirm whether all weapons had been accounted for. In Ashley's case, that gap turned out to be fatal. Ballistics recovered from the March 31st crime scene would later confirm the weapon used was a Glock 19, not among the 3 firearms listed in the surrender affidavit. That weapon had never been registered under Samuel's name and had not been reported stolen. But in the days after March 23rd, there was no crime scene, no blood, no indication that Ashley's fears would come to pass. And so the case went quiet. She changed the locks, but he still had access. She watched the windows, but there were no violations of the court order. Technically, he'd followed the rules. What no one accounted for was motive sustained over time. A grudge is not illegal. Ownership of a hidden weapon is only a crime when it's found. And for 8 more days, nothing was found. March 25th to March 30th, 2025, a 6-day window. No further calls to law enforcement, no documented violations of the no-contact order. From a procedural standpoint, everything appeared stable. But in the background, quiet movement was underway. The court order required Samuel Vaya to stay away from Ashley Vaya's residence and to relinquish his firearms. Both steps, on paper, had been satisfied. He'd signed the affidavit. 3 weapons were turned over. No electronic monitoring was issued. No warrant was filed to search his property or verify the completeness of his surrender. Deltona PD did not conduct any follow-up visits. This, too, was standard protocol. What wasn't standard was the behavior that followed. Private surveillance footage obtained post-incident confirmed the presence of a gray 2013 Nissan Pathfinder in Ashley's neighborhood on 4 separate nights, March 25th, 26, 28, and 30. The vehicle remained parked at varying distances, each time for over 15 minutes between 12:45 and 2:30 a.m. The license plate was not captured in clear view on any single camera, but directional flow from traffic cams confirmed the vehicle entering and exiting the residential loop during those timeframes. Later checks would connect the vehicle to a family member of Samuel Vaya. At the time, no neighbors reported the sightings. No suspicion was raised. Nothing had happened. And that was the issue. Detective Angela Kiefer would later describe this period as the lull that systems mistake for resolution. Ashley did not file additional reports. She made no new complaints. But according to phone records and testimonial statements from 2 co-workers, she did make subtle changes. She stopped going out alone after 1 p.m. She canceled a standing grocery trip. She began asking her daughter to sleep with the baby monitor turned on. In one text message dated March 27th, Ashley wrote, "I don't think he's done. I think he's just being smarter." That same night, footage from a Ring doorbell 2 houses down from Ashley's captured movement on the side yard of her home. A figure stood just outside the sensor's primary field, visible only briefly in the lower left corner. Investigators couldn't confirm identity. The timestamp, 1:53 a.m., duration of presence, approximately 6 minutes. Entry was not attempted. Nothing was damaged. But the presence was not random. What made this stretch of time significant wasn't the lack of activity. It was the methodical presence in its absence. Forensic specialists would later note that the eventual point of entry, the backslider, showed no signs of forced manipulation. The locking mechanism functioned properly, but fingerprint swabs lifted from the handle revealed partial latent impressions matching Samuel's known prints. The timing of those impressions couldn't be definitively determined, but no legal re-entry to the property had occurred since his arrest. This placed him at the door sometime after March 24th and before the shooting on March 30th. The back door was unlocked the night of the murder, but that information wouldn't come until the crime scene investigation was underway. In this 6-day lead-up, that door wasn't seen as a vulnerability. It was assumed protected by distance and by law. In an interview later conducted with Ashley's sister, she described their final phone call as uneasy but casual. Ashley had mentioned hearing footsteps outside the night before, but she downplayed it. She said she was tired of feeling paranoid, that she didn't want to live like she was preparing for something that might never come. In retrospect, her decision not to press further was less about denial and more about exhaustion. When every safeguard looks like it's in place, there's little room left to justify fear, even when it's valid. For Ashley, the choice to remain at home, to avoid additional confrontation, to try and wait things out, these were not failures. They were survival strategies based on what the system told her was complete. The warning signs were never loud. There was no repeated violence, no threats caught on audio, but the consistency of Samuel's behavior, the silent returns, the observed surveillance, the familiarity with the property, painted a forensic portrait of intent. That intent wasn't visible to neighbors, it wasn't logged in public records, but it left patterns. And patterns, once examined in hindsight, rarely lie. Sunday, March 30th, 2025. Weather reports from Deltona logged mild temperatures and light cloud cover. Sunset was at 7:41 p.m. To the outside world, it was a quiet, uneventful day. Inside Ashley Vea's home, the rhythm of life continued as it had for weeks, low-key, guarded, and deliberate. Digital forensics, later recovered from Ashley's mobile device, offered a precise snapshot of that day's timeline. She sent her first message at 8:12 a.m., confirming an online grocery order for pickup. Between 9:30 a.m. and 1:15 p.m., she exchanged texts with a coworker, browsed preschool materials for her 2-year-old, and responded to a payment reminder from her bank. None of her messages indicated concern. There were no flagged phrases, no emotional spikes. By 2:00 p.m., location data confirmed her movement to a local public store, where she spent approximately 24 minutes. She returned home by 2:38 p.m. No anomalies in travel time, no detours. Phone records indicated a brief call to her sister just after 4:01 p.m., lasting under 5 minutes. She didn't mention any disturbances or specific fears. According to her sister's later statement, the conversation was normal, but short. From an investigator's standpoint, the final 12 hours before Ashley's death held significance, not in what changed, but in what didn't. No new calls, no last-minute warnings. But embedded within that stillness were details that, in aggregate, suggested Ashley was in a state of passive alertness. Her front blinds remained closed throughout the day. Camera footage from a neighbor's porch, time-stamped 5:19 p.m., showed Ashley exiting briefly to retrieve a package, then immediately returning inside. She did not speak to anyone in the driveway. The interior lights turned on at 6:02 p.m. A motion-activated backyard light triggered twice that evening, first at 8:43 p.m., then again at 10:11 p.m. No video coverage was available of her backyard. One key decision stood out. At 10:32 p.m., Ashley's phone connected briefly to her home's Wi-Fi security panel. She disarmed and rearmed the system within 1 minute. No entry had occurred, and there was no alarm triggered. Investigators interpreted this as either a system reset or a routine check. There were no unusual pings or failed login attempts. Her router logs showed consistent traffic, Netflix streaming, social media browsing, 2 doorbell camera syncs. All ordinary. But at 11:57 p.m., the external front camera disconnected. The signal cut without alert. Diagnostics later confirmed this was not a power failure. Someone had disabled it manually by accessing the housing unit mounted just above the doorframe. The equipment used was basic. No tampering was obvious from a distance. The only indication came from the abrupt drop in the timestamp, which never resumed. This was the first forensic anomaly of the night, and it went unnoticed until days later. Data from the interior smart assistant, a voice-enabled device, confirmed ambient noise levels remained unchanged between midnight and 2 a.m. There were no spoken commands, no music, just silence. What matters most about this timeline is what it reflects: routine behavior under persistent tension. Ashley had not left town. She had not changed her schedule. She'd stayed within the boundaries deemed safe, compliant with legal orders, surrounded by known variables. But what the forensic sequence revealed, hour by hour, was that another pattern was in motion, one that required no confrontation, only access. The disarmed camera, the dormant security panel, the unlocked back door, these were not the signs of a home in disarray. They were the indicators of proximity by someone familiar with both the layout and her habits. In a later interview, one of the detectives summarized the scene with clarity. Nothing about the house screamed forced entry. That was the problem. By 1:48 a.m. on March 31st, 2025, motion data from the Smart Assistant noted a subtle spike in the kitchen. It didn't register as movement, just a change in air pressure. Less than 40 minutes later, Ashley's daughter would return home and find her mother unresponsive. Those final 24 hours didn't provide an overt warning. They provided structure, a forensic framework in which each detail, each system login, light trigger, camera feed, formed a map of what normal looked like. So that when normal finally broke, investigators could see exactly where. At 2:22 a.m. on March 31st, 2025, emergency dispatch in Volusia County logged a 911 call from a female caller at a residence in Deltona. The caller identified herself as the daughter of the homeowner. Her voice was panicked but intelligible. The phrase that stood out to dispatchers and later to investigators reviewing the audio was this: "She's not breathing and the door was open." By 2:29 a.m., deputies were on scene. The first officer noted the interior lights were on, the front door unlocked. No signs of forced entry were visible at the front or side windows. The home was quiet. Two children were inside, one awake, one asleep. The caller led officers to the master bedroom. Ashley Via, 38, was found face down on the carpet between the side of the bed and the wall. A single entry wound was located behind her left ear. There was no exit wound. No shell casing was found at the scene. There were no signs of a physical struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken objects, no visible bruising on her hands or arms. The position of the body was consistent with sudden incapacitation. Crime scene documentation confirmed the bed was made, the lamp on, and a half-finished cup of water on the nightstand. Ashley had been wearing pajamas, no footwear. The floor beneath her was undisturbed, no drag marks, no pooling blood beyond the wound itself. Her cell phone was found on the pillow, locked, untouched. The back sliding door was closed but unlocked. Fingerprint analysis revealed partial prints on the interior handle. One print was identified as belonging to Ashley. The other matched a known print from Samuel Via's 2020 DMV renewal application. No other viable prints were recovered from the exterior pane. Detectives determined the point of entry was the rear slider. No pry marks, no damaged locking mechanism, just access and knowledge. In reviewing the prior surveillance records and the week-long timeline leading up to the murder, investigators established the likelihood that the assailant knew the layout of the home, the sleeping habits of the victim, and the placement of the interior light sources. The bullet trajectory, confirmed by the autopsy conducted later that afternoon, traveled downward at a 30-degree angle, passing through the base of the skull and into the upper cervical vertebrae. Immediate loss of consciousness, instant death. The lack of defensive wounds reinforced the theory that Ashley was either asleep or unaware of the intruder's presence. She had not risen from the bed. The position of her body indicated she rolled or collapsed after impact. It was silent, efficient, clean. The toddler in the adjacent room remained asleep. No signs of entry, no harm, no noise reported by the child. The weapon used, a Glock 19, was not found at the scene. No registered ownership record existed under Samuel Via's name. Investigators would later identify the firearm through ballistic fingerprinting. It was untraceable by standard registry systems. Purchased in a private sale, not reported stolen. The question that followed was not just how the weapon entered the home, but how the shooter entered undetected. No cameras were operational. The exterior doorbell system had been disabled. The interior alarm panel was logged as disarmed manually at 1:58 a.m., 24 minutes before the call to dispatch. The only user code on file belonged to Ashley. There were no signs of hacking or mechanical override. This raised the probability that the code had been memorized or previously used by someone with physical access. Later that week, law enforcement would reconstruct the shooter's likely route: approach from the east-facing rear yard, use of the slider for entry, direct movement to the bedroom, one shot fired, immediate exit. Less than 5 minutes on site. No verbal altercation, no secondary action. That level of control doesn't suggest impulse. It suggests intent supported by preparation. What stands out in this chapter of the case is not just the method, it's the silence, the absence of struggle, the removal of variables. This wasn't a confrontation. It was an execution. At 3:08 a.m. on March 31st, 2025, less than an hour after the 911 call from Ashley Via's residence was logged, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office issued a BOLO, be on the lookout, for a 2013 gray Nissan Pathfinder. The registered owner was a relative of Samuel Via. The vehicle had not been reported stolen. License plate data confirmed it had been spotted leaving Deltona heading northbound on Interstate 95. Traffic surveillance cameras mounted along I-95 began logging movement within minutes. At 3:17 a.m., a camera in Ormond Beach captured the Pathfinder, traveling in the rightmost lane, maintaining a speed just under the posted limit. No erratic driving, no indication of distress. The vehicle continued north through Flagler County. At 3:26 a.m., deputies stationed near Palm Coast initiated a rolling response. The Pathfinder was identified and tracked without immediate lights or sirens. Deputies waited until the vehicle passed a safe turnout before initiating an attempt to pull it over. At 3:29 a.m., lights were activated. The vehicle did not stop. Acceleration increased rapidly, from 65 mph to over 95 mph in under 12 seconds. What had been a standard traffic engagement became a full pursuit. Audio logs from dispatch record the pursuing officer's commentary in real time. Subject increasing speed, passing multiple vehicles, moving into shoulder. The chase extended for approximately 11 miles. At 3:41 a.m., the Pathfinder exited the highway onto a local connector road in Flagler County. At 3:43 a.m., the vehicle failed to negotiate a right-hand curve, struck a utility marker, and rolled. The car came to a stop on its side in a shallow ditch. Deputies approached with caution. No gunfire was reported during the approach. The driver was still breathing. Blood was visible on the driver's side window. The weapon, a Glock 19, was found in the center console with one spent casing beside it. The round was later matched to a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the temple. Entry wound on the right, exit on the left. Emergency medical teams arrived on scene by 3:50 a.m. The subject was transported under trauma alert to Advent Health Palm Coast. He was pronounced dead at 5:12 a.m. A ballistic match confirmed the same firearm used in the self-inflicted wound was consistent with the bullet retrieved from Ashley Via's autopsy. No other weapons were found in the vehicle. A soft body vest was recovered from the back seat. The vest had no ballistic damage. Inside the Pathfinder, investigators documented several additional items: a prepaid flip phone with no active SIM card, a printed photograph of Ashley and their son, and a handwritten list of dates, including March 23rd and March 30th, highlighted in red ink. No suicide note was found, no final message. The act itself was the only conclusion offered. In reviewing the vehicle's movement via highway license plate readers, analysts confirmed the vehicle had not taken any detours or changed plates. It had traveled directly from Deltona toward the northern county line without deviation. The data fit, and that, as investigators would later remark, was what made it even more calculated. The crash site was secured until daylight for secondary processing. Soil analysis confirmed no other vehicles or footprints near the ditch. No accomplice. No fleeing passenger. The route had been taken alone. The decision made in advance. The technical evaluation, movement logs, weapon confirmation, and crash forensics closed the investigative timeline in less than 36 hours. What remained were the procedural gaps and unanswered motives that had preceded it. But in terms of sequence, the case had reached its final physical moment. There would be no arrest, no trial, just a single route taken in silence, and one more child left without both parents. By the morning of March 31st, 2025, the physical investigation had entered its final phase. The suspect was dead. The weapon was recovered. The crime scene had been secured, but the process was far from over. At 9:14 a.m., the district medical examiner began the post-mortem on Ashley Via. The report was finalized within 48 hours and released to the investigative team the following week. Cause of death: single gunshot wound to the head. Manner of death: homicide. The projectile, recovered intact, matched the .9mm Glock 19 recovered from the suspect's vehicle. There was no hesitation pattern, no sign of struggle. The shot was fired from close range, less than 24 inches, at a downward angle. Based on soft tissue damage and spinal involvement, The examiner estimated instantaneous incapacitation. There were no defensive injuries. Ashley had not moved after being shot. Toxicology showed no alcohol, sedatives, or narcotics in her system. Her last meal was estimated to be 6 hours prior. She had been killed in the window between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. This matched the digital timestamps, door activity, and the timeline of the daughter's return. The autopsy did not reveal any older injuries or signs of prior assault. There was no external trauma except the fatal wound. In clinical terms, the act was quick and lethal. The weapon analysis confirmed the firing pin markings, rifling impressions, and serial number had been defaced but partially recoverable. The Glock had been purchased in a private transaction approximately 18 months earlier. The prior owner had died of natural causes. The transaction was not registered. The gun had not been reported stolen or missing. Chain of custody for the firearm and vehicle was documented from crash site to lab processing at the Volusia County Forensic Center. All items were secured by 6 p.m. on March 31st. Investigators began matching ballistic signatures, surface residue, and trace contact points. Fingerprints on the magazine, the slide, and the trigger matched those previously on file for Samuel Villa. DNA analysis was consistent across blood samples inside the vehicle and residue on the firearm. The Glock was the murder weapon. There was no doubt. The final forensic confirmation didn't just close the case, it confirmed that every step had followed a trajectory set in motion long before that Sunday night. But it wasn't only the evidence that came under review. Internal administrative records show that within days of the homicide, Volusia County's Domestic Violence Review Unit opened a procedural audit. The focus, whether earlier decisions, particularly following the March 23rd arrest, had failed to account for escalating behavioral risk. They re-examined the bond conditions, the no-contact order, the lack of follow-up on the firearm surrender, the failure to issue a search warrant despite Ashley's direct statement about an unregistered Glock. There was no single procedural violation, but the review identified a series of decisions made in isolation without contextual threat analysis. Ashley's testimony had not been dismissed. It had been processed as routine, and that distinction cost her the protection that context might have afforded. In a separate post-incident interview, one of the deputies assigned to the March 23rd call stated that Ashley seemed more worried than angry. Her tone, according to the deputy, was calm but resigned. That detail stayed in the internal record, because what it showed was that warning signs weren't always loud. Sometimes they came in the form of compliance. Polite reporting, no demands. When a system only reacts to violence, it tends to miss the conditions that lead to it. The state's report concluded that no policy had been broken, but recommended revisions to how risk is evaluated in domestic violence incidents involving unregistered firearms, especially when the suspect has ongoing access to shared property. It also proposed implementing a mandatory secondary inspection of firearms surrendered after a domestic battery arrest. None of that would change the outcome of Ashley Villa's case, but it would, in the coming months, inform 3 new legislative discussions across county lines. Quietly, without press conferences, without outrage. Sometimes system change doesn't come from headlines. It comes from a single unchecked box in a custody affidavit. Ashley Villa died in her home in the early hours of March 31st, 2025. The man responsible took his own life less than 2 hours later. The case, in legal terms, closed itself. There would be no indictment, no hearing, no trial. But there is no such thing as a clean ending in a domestic homicide. Ashley left behind 3 children. Her eldest son, 21, had recently moved into his own apartment. Her daughter, 19, was the one who made the 911 call, the first to see what no child should ever have to witness. Her youngest, barely 2 years old, slept through the entire crime, woke up without knowing the word widow or gunshot or what it means when you ask, "Where's mommy?" and no one answers. In the weeks that followed, the family attempted to hold a private memorial. No large public service, no press, just quiet grief. There was no formal victim impact statement submitted to court, because there was no court. The suspect had removed himself from the process. There was no justice to argue, only facts to confirm. One detective close to the case described the hardest part not as the scene, but the paperwork. Sealing a case file where every action taken, from bond to compliance form to evidence tag, was technically correct. That's where the fracture lives. Not in what was done wrong, but in what wasn't done enough. Ashley had reported. She had testified. She had signed every form asked of her. The system did not ignore her, it processed her. And yet by April 1st, her name had become another line in a growing national list. Women murdered by former partners after seeking legal protection. Florida's Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board opened a policy assessment on the Via case. Their focus wasn't on the homicide itself, but the administrative layers leading up to it. The unchecked key, the unverified weapon, the allowance of shared custody that allowed continued access to the home. The review didn't find misconduct, but it did find inertia. The proposed revisions included the introduction of a risk-based firearm verification protocol after domestic battery arrests, especially where victims report additional unregistered weapons. It also recommended removing physical access to shared residences unless monitored by third-party drop-offs, regardless of shared custody status. In Deltona, the case didn't make national news. It wasn't the kind of murder that dominates headlines. There were no viral court moments, no dramatic 911 tapes aired on television, but it left an imprint on the community. Neighbors who once waved across driveways now spoke about checking locks twice. Friends of the victim talked about not assuming calm meant safe. The most tragic element was that there had been no escalation. There had been no countdown. What happened that night was not a progression. It was a decision, one that had been made quietly, with knowledge and time and preparation. When the weapon was traced, it wasn't through clever detective work. It was because there was only one firearm left to match. When the motive was explored, there wasn't a manifesto or a confession. Only a history of entitlement, a pattern of control, and a refusal to accept boundaries. There was no note in the vehicle, no goodbye, just a silent assertion that if he couldn't control what came next, he would end it entirely. These are the cases that don't finish with closure. They finish with reminders that the absence of legal red flags doesn't mean the presence of safety, that not all threats raise their voices. Some simply wait. In the months following the murder, Ashley's daughter moved out of Florida. Her son transferred schools. The toddler was placed in the care of extended family. There was no family left unbroken, no return to normal. Only a new version of quiet. A final report on the case issued by the sheriff's office closed with a single paragraph acknowledging the system had operated within legal bounds. No disciplinary action, no internal failure. But the final line in that report, the one not printed, not cataloged, was written between all the forms Ashley signed. Being heard is not the same as being protected. Case closed. Deltona, Florida Ashley Via, 1987-2025. Sometimes the people we fear most are the ones who once had a key to our door. If there's anything I've learned, it's that silence doesn't always mean safety, and following the rules doesn't guarantee protection. I'm sharing this not for sympathy, but because someone watching might be where I was, afraid, unheard, and unsure of what to do next. You're not alone. Trust your instincts, ask for help, and don't wait for the system to catch up. What do you think could have changed this story? Do you believe our laws truly protect those they're meant to? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, tell me why. If you found this video meaningful, please hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next story we uncover together.